Meantime, the Pentagon says it's monitoring sites known to contain stockpiles of Colonel Gaddafi's chemical weapons. It's feared terrorist cells and militants could raid the arsenals, which allegedly include tons of uranium dust. For more on this, I'm now joined by James Corbett, a member of the Center for Research on Globalization, live from Osaka, Japan. Thank you for joining us today. So, NATO says it's absolutely critical to secure Gaddafi's vast chemical weapons arsenals. Given the chaos in Tripoli, a non-existent police force, a lack of structure among rebel fighters, just how safe are the stockpiles?
Well, it's an interesting question, but perhaps it presupposes the idea that the stockpiles are unsafe in the hands of the rebel forces and would be safer in the hands of the NATO forces, whereas the people who have so far been involved in sieging Tripoli and killing Tripoli civilians in Tripoli have been the NATO side. So I think the question is really who are the people to be concerned about having access to those weapons. But certainly there are, by the most conservative estimates, upwards of 500 civilians have been killed in the fighting so far, if not more, and it's difficult to get accurate numbers, obviously, at this point, but hundreds of civilians certainly have died at this point. So I think it would be strange to suggest that Gaddafi's forces would actually be interested in killing citizens in Tripoli, whereas the rebels are the ones actually laying siege to the city.
So it's hard to tell which side would be potentially more dangerous with access to these arsenals here. But let's talk about Gaddafi loyalists still in the city. I mean, perhaps they could launch a last-ditch attack using these weapons, or possibly proliferate them to terrorist factions in a spiteful act of revenge.
Well, again, I think the idea of them using them inside Libya is well, it's possible, but I would say it's rather far-fetched. I would imagine that if there was any danger to be had, it would be obviously in the proliferation of those weapons, as in early July, Gaddafi was quoted as saying that he would be willing to strike at Europe if Tripoli was attacked. So I guess that is a possibility. It seems to be on the table, but certainly it's unclear to me whether the weapons would be safer in the hands of Gaddafi's forces or the terrorists. I think ultimately perhaps getting rid of these types of weapons would be the ultimate goal for in terms of peace and stability.
All right, let's talk about Gaddafi himself. There have been reports that he's been hiding in a 20-kilometer network of heavily fortified tunnels beneath Tripoli. Do you believe he's still there, or indeed even in the country?
Personally, I have no knowledge of it and no way of finding out. I think it would be foolhardy to venture a guess at this point, especially when there's so much of a fog of war over the situation right now. And that's been demonstrated in all sorts of events, including the early reports we had that Gaddafi's sons had been captured by rebel forces, only to have video footage that was aired on RT of Gaddafi's son parading around in the center of Tripoli. So at this point, really, it's anyone's guess what's really happening there. And unfortunately, it's extremely difficult to get in touch with people there. As you know, and as I know, having tried to contact Mahdi Nazem-Roya, who's also reporting for the Center for Research on Globalization from Tripoli, and actually having the experience of talking to him and having the line cut out suddenly, it's just really, really difficult to get a hold of and keep in touch with people there at the moment. So there is a fog of war, and it's really anyone's guess where Gaddafi is at the moment. And I think there's disinformation being put out on both sides of the coin at this point in terms of what both sides are capable of and what's so far been achieved.
It certainly does seem there's been some back and forth with disinformation about the capture of Gaddafi's sons, and as you said, these blackouts that have occurred as well are limiting the communications there in Tripoli. But if indeed Gaddafi is still underground in these huge tunnels that have been dug apparently for the past 25-30 years, just how far would NATO go to smoke him out? Do you think they would dare deploy the bunker buster bombs or the Moabs, the mother of all bombs, do you think? Because it may seem possible the rebels could not get into these heavily fortified tunnels.
It certainly does seem a possibility, and there are reports even that there's a tank battalion in these giant underground tunnel complexes. So the idea that there would be bunker busters or other types of heavy weaponry used in trying to lay siege to it is not out of the question. And certainly NATO has demonstrated that they have no compunction about using these types of weapons on civilian populations and in civilian populated areas. So there would certainly be no moral qualms about that, and unfortunately likely no International Criminal Court investigation of the war crimes being perpetrated by the NATO-led rebel forces at this moment.
Now, the UN says it's working to release up to $100 billion of frozen assets to the new transitional government. Some say that for a government barely 6 months old, it's simply not ready to handle such cash. What do you think?
Certainly, I think it would be foolish to hand that sum of money over to a transitional council which has yet to demonstrate that it has the support of the vast majority of the country, and even by their own standards, even at recent meetings, obviously Libya is very much divided along tribal lines, as you know, and of the dozens and dozens of different tribes represented in Libya, only less than half of them actually claim to be in support of the transitional council. So there's deep divisions going on in Libya right now, and I think it would be very foolhardy to release those types of funds to a transitional government which so far has really only demonstrated its interest in securing oil contracts with foreign and Western companies.
Well, that certainly seems to be the point right now, with European oil companies already trying to stake their claims with the mineral reserves of Libya. And as you were saying, we've had analysts also discussing the fact that these representatives in this new transitional government come from various tribal factions that don't always see eye to eye. James Corbett, editor of the Corbett Report news website, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rory.